It was a cold, dreary evening in Ohio, the type of night where the wind howled through the trees and the scent of wet earth filled the air. The town of Riverside was quiet, its residents tucked into their homes, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold in the quiet suburb. Detective Sarah Thompson stood in the doorway of the Johnson family home, her eyes scanning the scene before her. The once neat and orderly house now felt foreign to her, its silence almost suffocating. As she stepped over the threshold, the distinct scent of blood lingered in the air. In the living room, sprawled across the plush carpet, was the lifeless body of Thomas Johnson. The scene was chaotic. Furniture overturned, shards of glass littering the floor, and blood pooling around the man's body. But it wasn't the brutality of the scene that shook Sarah. It was the fact that Thomas Johnson was a police officer, a well-respected cop in Riverside. His death, now ruled a murder, would send shockwaves through the community, and Sarah knew it was only a matter of time before the investigation turned into something much darker than anyone could have imagined. The first thing Sarah did was turn to the family. The wife, Rachel Johnson, stood in the corner of the room, her eyes wide with fear. She was trembling, her hands wringing a piece of cloth as if she could squeeze the truth out of it. Their 13-year-old son, Joshua, sat silently on the couch, his eyes blank, unblinking. He had been born with cerebral palsy and was unable to move without assistance, his world confined to the boundaries of his home. Rachel's face was pale as she looked at her husband's body, her lips trembling. "I didn't do it," she whispered, almost to herself. "I didn't kill him." Sarah's eyes softened for a moment. She had seen many families in distress, but something about Rachel's demeanor didn't sit right with her. Was it fear or something else? "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice firm but calm, "I need you to tell me everything that happened here tonight." Rachel shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know how this happened. I went to check on Joshua, and when I came back, Thomas, he was dead." Sarah took a deep breath. The scene looked like a domestic dispute gone terribly wrong, but there was one problem. Rachel had an airtight alibi. She had been in the living room with Joshua the entire evening. There was no way she could have committed the murder. But something still didn't add up. The way Rachel spoke, the way she avoided looking directly at Sarah, hinted that there was more to the story. As Sarah continued to observe her, she noticed something that made her stomach churn. A small piece of blood-stained clothing caught in the folds of Rachel's sleeve. The evidence was piling up. Sarah was sure that the woman was hiding something. Rachel's voice broke through her thoughts. "I didn't kill him, detective. You have to believe me." But belief had little to do with it. Facts did. And right now, the facts pointed to one thing. Rachel Johnson was the primary suspect. The investigation had just begun, and already Sarah knew she was dealing with a case that would unravel in the most unexpected ways. There was something darker behind Thomas's death, and Rachel was at the center of it. But there was one more thing Sarah couldn't ignore. The moment she entered the house, Joshua had locked eyes with her, a look of pure terror in his gaze. Had he seen something? Did he know more than he was letting on? Rachel's eyes darted nervously between Sarah and her son, a guilty flicker crossing her face. But before Sarah could press her further, the uniformed officers outside the house interrupted. "We've secured the premises, Detective," Officer Grant said, his voice low. "Good," Sarah responded, her mind racing with questions. "Get the lab team in here. We need to start the search for evidence." As the team moved in, Sarah stood motionless, taking in the room one last time. There was something about the place, something sinister. The unease that lingered in the air was palpable, but the answer to what had truly happened here would take time to uncover. For now it was Rachel's word against the facts, and those facts painted a chilling picture of a mother who had seemingly snapped. Sarah arrived at the Riverside Police Department early the next morning, still grappling with the haunting images from the Johnson house. The air outside was crisp, and the faint sound of traffic hummed in the background as she walked through the department's entrance. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and paper lingered. Officers moved about, some talking in hushed tones, others glued to their computer screens. She made her way to her desk where a pile of case files sat waiting for her. But today her mind was far from paperwork. She had a hunch. Something wasn't right with this case, and if anyone could help her make sense of it, it was Marcus. Detective Marcus Reynolds was a veteran of the force, one of the sharpest investigators Sarah had ever known. He had an almost eerie ability to spot the smallest detail that others overlooked. If anyone could uncover the truth behind Thomas Johnson's death, it was him. Sarah found Marcus in his office, sipping his morning coffee. His piercing brown eyes met hers as she entered, his face calm but focused. "I've been thinking about Rachel," she began, taking a seat across from him. "Her reaction last night, it was all over the place. I'm not sure she's as innocent as she claims." Marcus set his cup down and leaned forward. "You think she's faking it? Playing the grieving widow?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, "but there's something about her story that doesn't sit right. She says she didn't do it, but the bloodstains on her sleeve, they're troubling. And then there's Joshua. The way he looked at me last night, he seemed to know something. But he's so young, and with his condition, he can't exactly tell us what happened. That's why I think we need to dig deeper into the Johnson family's past. Rachel's not giving us the full picture." Marcus nodded slowly. "I'll handle the background check on Thomas and Rachel. We need to know more about their marriage, any previous incidents, anything that could give us a motive." "I'll take Joshua," Sarah said, determination in her voice. "I'll try to talk to him, see if we can get anything out of him. Maybe he saw something." The two detectives stood up and nodded in unison, agreeing on their next steps. But as Sarah headed out of the office, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this case was going to turn into something much darker than anyone anticipated. Later that day, Sarah arrived at the Johnson home. Rachel had been allowed to stay in the house for the time being, but she was under strict surveillance. As Sarah walked up the front steps, she noticed the way Rachel avoided her gaze, her movements stiff and uneasy. The once welcoming house now felt like a prison. Inside, Rachel sat on the couch, her hands nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. Joshua was in his wheelchair, positioned in the corner of the room. His large, sad eyes followed Sarah as she entered, his expression vacant. "How are you holding up, Rachel?" Sarah asked, sitting down on a chair opposite her. Rachel forced a smile. "I don't know. It feels like a nightmare. I still can't believe Thomas is gone." "I understand," Sarah said gently. "I know this is hard for you, but I need to ask you some questions, just to help us understand what happened." Rachel nodded, her lips quivering. "I'll do anything to help." Sarah didn't waste any time. "Rachel, you said last night that you were in the living room with Joshua when Thomas was killed. Can you walk me through exactly what happened? Did you hear anything unusual? Did anything seem out of place?" Rachel's eyes darted to Joshua, who remained motionless in his wheelchair. She took a deep breath, clearly struggling to hold herself together. "I was with Joshua. I was just trying to get him settled for bed. Then I heard a noise from the other room. It was like a crash, like something falling over. I went to check on Thomas, and I saw him lying there. I didn't know what to do. I tried to help him, but it was too late. I swear, detective, I didn't kill him." Sarah watched her carefully. Rachel was frantic, but Sarah didn't feel the same genuine panic she had seen from other people in shock. There was something calculated about her response, something almost rehearsed. "I know this is difficult," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But did you and Thomas ever have any issues? Arguments? Anything that could explain this?" Rachel's face flushed, and she looked away. "No, we were fine. We had our disagreements like any married couple, but nothing that would lead to this. Thomas was a good man, a good father." Sarah didn't fully buy it. She could see the tension in Rachel's shoulders, the way she kept shifting her weight uncomfortably. There was something she wasn't saying, but Sarah needed to be patient. Pressing too hard now could make her clam up. "Have you ever noticed anything strange about Thomas's behavior lately? Anything that could explain his death? Or did he ever act differently around Joshua?" Rachel stiffened again at the mention of their son. "No, Thomas was always a good father. He loved Joshua. He was his primary caregiver. I was just too busy with everything else to..." to be as involved. But Thomas, he was he was dedicated. He would never hurt him. The mention of her son seemed to strike a nerve, but Sarah didn't let it go unnoticed. She turned her attention to Joshua, whose eyes had been glued to her since she walked into the room. "Joshua," she began softly, "can you tell me what happened that night? Do you remember anything?" Joshua blinked, his gaze distant. Sarah's heart ached as she watched him struggle to find the right words. His condition made it nearly impossible for him to communicate clearly, but his eyes, they told a story. He stared at her, then at his mother and back at her again. It was as if he knew something, but he couldn't find a way to express it. Sarah leaned in closer. "Joshua, if you can hear me, it's okay. You can tell me what happened. We just want to help." But Joshua remained silent, his fingers twitching nervously. Sarah's mind raced as she observed him. What was he trying to say? And why was Rachel so quick to deflect any suspicion regarding Joshua's father? After a few moments, Sarah stood up, her mind made up. "Rachel, I'm going to need you to stay here. We'll be back in touch with more questions. And Joshua, we'll make sure you get the help you need." Back at the precinct, Marcus was already knee-deep in the background check. As Sarah returned to her office, she found him hunched over a pile of papers, his eyes scanning every detail. He looked up as she entered. "Found something," Marcus said, a grim expression on his face. "Thomas Johnson had a history. Nothing major, but it seems he was involved in a couple of domestic disputes before he met Rachel. Apparently he had some anger issues in his past, and though he was a cop, there were whispers about his behavior around children." Sarah's stomach sank. Could this be a motive? Was Thomas hiding something darker behind his badge? Marcus continued. "But here's the kicker. Rachel, she's been hiding a lot. I got into her financials. It looks like she was struggling, and Thomas had been trying to get her to stop spending so much money. But the weird part is, Rachel had taken out a life insurance policy on Thomas, just months before his death. She was the beneficiary. The information Marcus uncovered sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. Rachel Johnson wasn't just grieving the sudden loss of her husband. She might have been planning for it. The life insurance policy, the whispers about Thomas's temper, the strange distance between the couple. It all pointed toward a carefully constructed web of deception. Sarah stood in her office, staring at the file Marcus had handed her. Her fingers traced the edge of the paperwork, trying to piece together what had truly happened in that house. The more she dug into the Johnson family's past, the murkier the situation became. Rachel's financials were troubling. The life insurance policy had been taken out in Thomas's name just a few months before his death. She was listed as the beneficiary, set to inherit a substantial sum. The timing was suspicious, and when paired with the recent financial strain Rachel had been facing, it painted a picture of a woman who might have been desperate for money. But Sarah couldn't leap to conclusions just yet. Rachel might have been a victim of her circumstances, stressed, overwhelmed, and trying to keep her family afloat. But there was still the question of Joshua. Her mind kept returning to the boy. His silence was deafening, and the way he had looked at her when she entered the house the previous night. It wasn't just fear. It was as if he knew something, something crucial. The child had witnessed something, but what? And why had he been so quiet during the interrogation? Sarah glanced at the clock. It was nearly 4 p.m. The investigation had already taken an unsettling turn, but there was still so much left to uncover. She called Marcus into her office. "We need to dig deeper into Thomas's past," she said, motioning for him to sit. "Find out more about these domestic disputes. I want to know exactly what kind of man Thomas really was. We also need to find out who he was really close to at work. There's a chance he may have confided in someone who knew more than they let on." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I'll get on it. What about Rachel? I'm going to talk to her again, but this time I'll focus on her financials, her spending habits, the life insurance. There's something she's not telling us, and I think that's our way in." Marcus stood up and gave a short nod before leaving to begin his research. As soon as the door shut behind him, Sarah leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but there was still a missing link. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than just a wife who wanted her husband dead for financial gain. It felt like a web of lies, and she was determined to find the center. That evening, Sarah returned to the Johnson home. Rachel was sitting in the same spot on the couch, her hands nervously folding and unfolding a tissue. Joshua was still in his wheelchair, though he appeared to be in a daze, his gaze fixed on something far away. It broke Sarah's heart to see him like this. He was a child, trapped in a body that wouldn't cooperate, unable to voice his thoughts, his fears. But Sarah wasn't here to sympathize. She needed answers. "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm as she took a seat across from the woman, "I need to ask you some more questions, this time about the life insurance policy." Rachel's eyes flickered, a subtle shift that didn't go unnoticed. "What about it?" she asked, her voice tight. "You took out a life insurance policy on Thomas a few months ago, correct?" Sarah said, watching Rachel closely for her reaction. Rachel stiffened but quickly recovered. "Yes, I did. But it wasn't what you think. Thomas was always in good health. I just thought it was a smart decision. You never know what could happen, and I wanted to make sure Joshua and I would be taken care of if something ever happened to him." Sarah didn't buy the explanation. Rachel's hands were trembling now, and her eyes darted to Joshua, who remained eerily still. "Rachel, there's no doubt that a life insurance policy can be a good safety net," Sarah said, her tone gentle but probing. "But the timing here is unusual. You took the policy out not long before Thomas's death, and you were struggling financially. Was that the only reason you did it?" Rachel's face paled, and Sarah could see the conflict in her eyes. The tension in the room was palpable, and Sarah knew that Rachel wasn't being entirely truthful. Rachel's silence was more damning than any confession could have been. "I just wanted to make sure we were secure," Rachel whispered, almost too softly for Sarah to hear. "Thomas didn't understand. He thought I was spending too much money, but I had to. I needed things for Joshua, medical bills, and I couldn't keep asking him for help." It was the first time Rachel had shown any sign of vulnerability, and for a brief moment, Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy. But the nagging feeling in her gut told her to stay focused. "And what about Joshua?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady. "Do you think Thomas would have hurt him? Or do you think he was capable of something like that?" Rachel recoiled, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, Thomas would never hurt Joshua. He loved him. He was everything to him." But Sarah's instincts were telling her there was more to the story. Rachel's defense of Thomas felt rehearsed, as if she was trying too hard to convince herself. Sarah could see it, the way Rachel couldn't meet her eyes when she spoke about her husband, the hesitation in her voice. "I've been speaking to your son, Rachel," Sarah said, her tone careful but direct. "Joshua knows something. I can tell by the way he's looking at me. He knows what happened, but he's not talking. You need to help us understand what happened." Rachel's eyes flickered, her face tightening. "Joshua? He's just a boy," she said, her voice cracking. "He doesn't know anything. He couldn't." "Rachel, please," Sarah pressed. "You need to tell me the truth. Did Thomas hurt Joshua? Was there something going on that we don't know about?" Rachel froze. For a long moment she didn't speak. Then slowly she looked at her son, her eyes darkening with a mixture of sorrow and fear. I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered. "Thomas was a good man, a good father. He was a little strict, but he loved Joshua. I don't know why you're bringing this up now." But Sarah knew that Rachel was lying. There was something she was hiding, and she couldn't escape it. Joshua might have seen something, but it wasn't just about the murder. It was about something that had been happening long before that fateful night. Something that had been hidden behind closed doors. Sarah's gaze shifted to Joshua, whose eyes were still fixed on her. There was something in them now, a flicker of recognition, as if he was finally processing her words. He looked directly at her, his lips parting as though he was about to speak. But before Sarah could react, Rachel jumped up, her hands raised in panic. "No, don't ask him any more questions. He can't tell you anything. Please don't hurt him." Sarah stood slowly, her heart pounding. Rachel's reaction was the final piece of the puzzle. It was clear now. She had been hiding something. The truth was finally within reach, and the one person who could unlock it was the very child Rachel had been trying to protect. "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice steady, "you need to step aside. Let me talk to Joshua. He knows more than you think." The silence in the room felt suffocating as Sarah slowly approached Joshua's wheelchair. His eyes, still wide with that same distant look, flickered nervously toward his mother before shifting back to Sarah. His lips quivered as if he wanted to say something, but no sound came. Rachel's panic was palpable. She stood between Sarah and Joshua, her hands outstretched as if trying to shield him. "Please," she begged, her voice trembling. "He can't tell you anything. He's not capable of it." Sarah's gaze didn't waver from Joshua. Her voice softened, but the urgency was clear. "Rachel, I know you're scared, but Joshua is the key to this case. I'm not going to hurt him. I just want to know what happened. He knows something, I can see it in his eyes. Please let me talk to him." Rachel hesitated, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes darted between Sarah and her son. She seemed torn, caught between the truth and the lie she had so carefully constructed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she stepped back reluctantly, giving Sarah the space she needed. "Joshua," Sarah said gently, squatting down to his level, "I know this is hard for you, but I need you to help me. Can you tell me what happened to your father?" For a moment, Joshua didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the floor. But then, as Sarah waited patiently, he began to move his hand, slowly, hesitantly, toward his mother's lap, as if seeking comfort. Sarah's heart ached, but she didn't break her focus. She knew this moment was crucial. Joshua's mind might not be fully able to communicate in a way others could understand, but his actions, they spoke volumes. There was something he wanted to say. "Joshua," Sarah said softly, "I'm here to help you. You don't need to be afraid. Just tell me what you remember." A tear slipped down Joshua's cheek, but he remained silent. Then in a soft whisper that barely reached Sarah's ears, he said something. "Daddy. Hurt." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She looked up at Rachel, whose face had gone pale. Rachel quickly reached down to comfort Joshua, her hands shaking. "No, Joshua, don't say that," she whispered, trying to hush him. But Sarah didn't miss the slip. "Hurt." The word echoed in her mind as she turned her attention back to Joshua. "What do you mean, Joshua?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, her hand gently resting on his arm. "What did Daddy do?" Joshua's gaze flickered between his mother and Sarah again. There was confusion in his eyes, a storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. Then, almost as if he had no control over it, he lifted his hand and pointed toward the hallway that led to the kitchen, where the door to the basement stood ajar. Sarah's heart raced. "The basement?" she asked softly. "Joshua, did something happen in the basement?" At that, Rachel's face twisted in fear. "No!" she cried, rushing to cover Joshua's hand, but it was too late. The moment had passed. Sarah stood up slowly, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Rachel, I need to know what happened in that basement. This is your last chance to tell the truth." Rachel's hands clenched at her sides, her lips trembling as she fought to control her emotions. I can't." But before she could finish, Sarah interrupted. "You've already lied to me. This is your last chance to tell me the truth, Rachel. Whatever you're hiding, we'll find it. You can't protect him forever." Rachel collapsed onto the couch, her hands covering her face as her body trembled. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Thomas, he wasn't who you thought he was. He wasn't a good man. He was abusive. He hurt Joshua. He hurt me too." Sarah's mind spun as the words hit her like a physical blow. She had suspected there was something darker at play, but hearing it from Rachel's lips confirmed it. The abuse had been hidden behind the image of the hard-working, dutiful father, the devoted husband. But beneath that mask was a man who had terrorized his own family. Rachel continued, her voice barely audible. "Thomas didn't mean to hurt Joshua. He just didn't understand. He thought if he disciplined him harshly, maybe he'd get better. But it made him worse. And I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't protect him, Sarah." Tears streamed down Rachel's face now, her grief mingling with the weight of her guilt. She seemed broken, as if confessing the truth had drained her of all strength. "I tried to leave. I really did," Rachel said through her sobs. "But every time I made plans, he'd beg me to stay. He said he'd change, and I believed him. But he never did. He got worse. He got angrier." Sarah's heart tightened as she watched the woman in front of her. It was hard to reconcile the image of a mother who had been so protective of her son with the woman who had been too afraid to stop the abuse. But now there was no more running from the truth. Rachel's hands were shaking violently as she wiped her eyes. "I never thought he'd hurt Joshua like that. But one night, he snapped. It wasn't just yelling anymore. He grabbed Joshua and threw him against the wall, and that's when I knew I couldn't keep letting it happen." Sarah felt a surge of rage that she quickly suppressed. "What happened after that? What did you do?" Rachel's eyes became distant, as if she were reliving the trauma all over again. "I didn't know what to do. I was scared. I couldn't leave him. Not like that. So I tried to make him understand, tried to make him see what he was doing, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept getting angrier." She paused as if gathering her thoughts. "And then I did something horrible. I took out the life insurance policy. I thought if I could just get enough money to get out of this, if I could just make sure Joshua and I would be okay." Sarah's mind raced. Rachel hadn't been trying to protect her husband. She'd been planning her escape. But why then had she stayed? Why hadn't she reported the abuse to the authorities? Was it out of fear, or was there something more to it? Before Sarah could press for more answers, Rachel's voice broke again. "And then, one night, it all just came to a head. Thomas came home late, angry. He was yelling at me, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong. I tried to stop him from hurting Joshua again, but he was too strong. He went into the basement, and I followed him. He was furious, pacing, and when he turned around and grabbed me, I thought he was going to kill me. And in that moment, I just, I didn't know what happened. I grabbed the gun. I don't even remember taking it, but I had it. And before I knew it, it was all over. He was lying on the floor, and I couldn't undo it. I couldn't take it back." Her confession left Sarah stunned. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they only created a more complex picture. Rachel had acted in self-defense, in fear for her son's life, but the situation had spiraled out of control. Sarah's mind was spinning, trying to process everything Rachel had just admitted. But one thing was clear. There was more to this story than just a simple case of murder. The dynamics in the Johnson household were far darker than anyone had realized, and now Sarah had to figure out what to do with the truth. The weight of Rachel's confession hung heavily in the room. Sarah could feel the air thick with the tension of guilt and fear. Rachel's face was a mask of regret and sorrow as she sat hunched over, trembling. Her hands, once desperately trying to protect her son, now lay limply in her lap. Sarah had expected some level of remorse, but the level of devastation on Rachel's face was beyond what she'd anticipated. Joshua, who had been eerily quiet during the entire exchange, slowly lifted his eyes to Sarah's. There was something different in his gaze now, more clarity, more awareness, as if he had, at last, decided to trust her. "Joshua," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm, "can you tell me what happened after she shot your dad?" The boy's eyes darted to his mother, then back to Sarah. His lips quivered, and for a moment Sarah wasn't sure if he would speak at all. Then, almost as if a dam had broken, he whispered, He was going to hurt her again." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The words had been small, almost drowned by the weight of what had come before, but they were crucial. Joshua wasn't just a passive victim. He was an active witness to the violence that had been an ongoing part of their lives. Rachel's face crumpled at the mention of the incident, her sobs muffled by her hands as she buried her face in them. "I didn't want this," she gasped between sobs. "I didn't want to kill him, but he gave me no choice." Rachel's admission of fear and trauma had taken Sarah by surprise. She had thought she was prepared for every eventuality, but hearing Rachel speak of her final moments with Thomas made everything more complicated. There were no heroes in this story, just flawed, broken people caught in a cycle they didn't know how to escape. Rachel raised her head, eyes bloodshot and swollen. I never meant to hurt him. I just wanted him to stop hurting us. Her words hung in the air, and Sarah's heart broke for her. In that moment, she understood that Rachel wasn't a cold-blooded murderer. She was a mother pushed to the edge by years of suffering. But the law didn't care about motives. It only cared about facts, about the chain of events that led to a man's death. Sarah's mind quickly shifted from empathy to strategy. Rachel's confession would be a crucial piece of the investigation, but she couldn't let herself be clouded by sympathy. The fact remained that Thomas Johnson was dead, and Rachel had been the one to pull the trigger. Rachel, Sarah said, her voice firm but not unkind, I need you to understand something. What you've told me today changes everything. But I still have to ask, did you plan to kill Thomas that night? Rachel shook her head violently, her hands gripping her knees as if trying to ground herself. No, no, I didn't plan it. I never wanted to kill him. I just wanted him to stop. He was out of control and I didn't know what else to do. Sarah nodded slowly, processing her words. You said you grabbed a gun. Where did it come from? Rachel hesitated, looking down at her lap as if the question had made her retreat into herself. It was Thomas's gun. He kept it locked away in the basement. I didn't even know where it was until that night. I went down there to find him, to stop him from hurting Joshua again. I was trying to get control of the situation, and then it just happened. Sarah's mind raced. This was the first time Rachel had mentioned the gun, and its sudden appearance made the whole situation even more suspicious. If Rachel hadn't planned to use the weapon, why was it so readily accessible? The basement, where Thomas had kept the gun, had become a pivotal part of the story, but Sarah couldn't make sense of the sequence of events. Rachel's fear was palpable, but that didn't change the fact that Thomas was dead. The law would have to sort out whether this was self-defense or manslaughter or something worse. You were in the basement when it happened? Sarah asked, her voice steady. Rachel nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Yes, Thomas was yelling at me, telling me I was ruining everything. He was so angry. He tried to grab me, and that's when I saw the gun on the shelf. I didn't think. I just reached for it. And when he came at me, I shot him. There was no denying the horror in Rachel's voice, no doubt about the pain she was feeling. But there were still gaps. Too many things left unsaid. Too many details that were fuzzy. Sarah had learned over the years that confessions like these were often the tip of the iceberg. The truth always ran deeper. Rachel, Sarah said, her eyes narrowing slightly, I'm going to have to ask you a very difficult question. Was your husband's death an accident, or was it something you did to stop him from hurting you again? Rachel swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the floor. For a long moment, she didn't speak. The room felt like it was closing in on them. Sarah could see Rachel's internal battle, the struggle between guilt and self-preservation. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice barely audible. I never meant to kill him, but I wanted him to stop. I wanted him to stop hurting Joshua. I didn't know what else to do. Sarah stood there, feeling the weight of Rachel's words settle over her like a shroud. The truth was there, buried beneath the surface of every sentence Rachel had spoken, but it wasn't clear-cut. There were still so many unanswered questions. Just as Sarah was about to speak again, she was interrupted by the sound of a knock on the door. Marcus entered, his face grim. Sarah, I've got news, he said, handing her a folder. I just spoke to the local gun store owner. Turns out Thomas Johnson had purchased a gun just a few months ago. He registered it under his name. But there's something else. He made a special request for a gun with a silencer. The revelation hit Sarah like a cold wave. A silencer. It made sense now. Rachel hadn't heard the gunshot when Thomas had been shot. That explained why there had been no neighbors who heard the commotion, no sound of a struggle. The gun Rachel had grabbed was not just any weapon. It had been designed to kill quietly. Rachel's eyes widened, and she turned to Sarah with a look of fear and confusion. But he wouldn't have used it on us, right? He wasn't planning to hurt us with it. It was for something else. I don't know why he bought it. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. There was so much she still didn't know, so much she still needed to piece together. But this new information only added more layers to the investigation. Was Thomas planning something more sinister? And why had he been so determined to keep a weapon with a silencer in the house, knowing full well the kind of man he was? The case was becoming more convoluted by the minute. The line between victim and perpetrator was growing increasingly blurred, and Sarah had to tread carefully. Rachel's confession had opened a door, but it had also revealed more questions than answers. As Marcus stepped aside, Sarah took a deep breath and turned back to Rachel. The truth was out there, but finding it would take more than just a confession. It would take everything Sarah had to uncover the final pieces of this dark puzzle. The room felt suffocating as Sarah sat in the quiet, processing the weight of the new revelations. Marcus stood by the door, flipping through the contents of the folder he had handed to her. Every detail was starting to form a clearer picture, but it wasn't a straightforward one. The case was twisting and turning into something more intricate than she had anticipated. Rachel sat across from her face drained of color, her eyes hollow. She was a mother, guilt-ridden, broken by the choices she had made to protect her son, but now caught in a web of deceit that had become far more complex than she had realized. The purchase of the silencer, the way Thomas had behaved the night of his death, all of it was pointing to something much darker than Rachel's initial confession suggested. Sarah glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already well past midnight. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp on the table. The silence between them was suffocating, but Sarah knew she had to push forward. The truth was out there. She just had to find the missing pieces. "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice low but firm, "we need to talk about the silencer. Why did Thomas have it? You told me you didn't know where the gun came from, but it's clear now that he had it for a reason. If he wasn't planning to hurt you or Joshua with it, what was his plan?" Rachel flinched at the mention of the silencer, her eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't know. He never told me about it. He was always so secretive about everything. But he wasn't like that before. He used to be normal. We used to be a family, Sarah. A normal family." Sarah's gaze didn't leave Rachel's face. "So when did he change? When did he start being violent?" Rachel closed her eyes for a long moment, her hand trembling as she wiped away a tear. "It wasn't overnight," she whispered. "It was gradual. At first he would come home late, maybe a few drinks in him, and he'd get frustrated with Joshua. But it started getting worse when he lost his job. He'd yell, then hit. I tried to stop him, but it was like he didn't even see me anymore. Like I wasn't even there." The pain in Rachel's voice was raw, and for a moment Sarah's anger flared. This was more than just a case of self-defense. It was the unraveling of a family, of a mother who had been silenced and controlled by fear for years. But as much as Sarah sympathized, she couldn't lose sight of the facts. There was still a man dead, and that meant there were still questions that needed answers. "Did you ever think about leaving him?" Sarah asked, her voice softer now. Rachel's eyes flickered with a mixture of guilt and hopelessness. "I did, but where would I go? Joshua needed care, special care that I couldn't afford on my own. And Thomas, he promised me he'd change. He always promised. But every time I tried to leave, he'd beg me to stay. He said he'd fix things. I believed him. I kept hoping he'd go back to being the man I married." "And the gun?" Sarah pressed. "When did you first see it? Why didn't you tell anyone about it?" Rachel shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. "He hid it well. He said it was for protection, that he needed it to feel safe. I never thought much of it until that night. That night, everything changed." The thought of the silencer still gnawed at Sarah. If Thomas had used it for protection, why was he so secretive about it? And why had he gotten it in the first place? His violent tendencies were becoming clearer with every passing moment, but the presence of the silencer was still unsettling. Before Sarah could ask more, Marcus stepped forward, holding a photo in his hand. It was a grainy shot of a man entering a local gun store, a tall, broad-shouldered figure. "I pulled the surveillance footage from the gun store. This is the man who bought the silencer and the gun. We're still working on identifying him, but I thought you should see this." Sarah took the photo and studied it. The man in the image didn't look like Thomas. In fact, he looked completely different. His posture was more confident, the way he held himself, less like someone who was used to being controlled. The face wasn't familiar to Sarah at all, and that sent a cold chill down her spine. "Who is he?" she asked, her voice tight. Marcus sighed, shaking his head. "I'm not sure. We're running his face through the system, but no hits so far." "Could it be someone Thomas was involved with?" Sarah asked, trying to piece together the larger picture. "It's possible," Marcus replied. "We've also looked into his contacts, friends, colleagues, people from his past, but nothing's adding up. It's almost like he's been living a double life." A cold realization hit Sarah like a slap in the face. Thomas wasn't just a violent man. He had been hiding something far bigger. The silencer, the mysterious gun purchase, and now this unknown figure entering the gun store. It was starting to look like Thomas had been preparing for something major. "Rachel," Sarah said, her voice hardening, "was Thomas involved in anything illegal? Did he have any connections you didn't know about? Any debts, shady dealings, or people he was keeping from you?" Rachel's eyes widened at the question, and she shook her head, her voice trembling. "No, no, I swear I didn't know anything. I would have left him if I had known. I, I didn't want that life for us." But Sarah wasn't convinced. "You didn't know? Or you didn't want to know?" Rachel's face crumpled again, and she buried her face in her hand, sobbing uncontrollably. "I didn't want to know, Sarah. I didn't want to see the truth. I thought he could change. I thought he loved me." It was painful to watch, and for a moment Sarah hesitated, but the facts were still there. The silencer, the strange man at the gun store, the growing evidence that Thomas had been hiding something sinister. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. Thomas Johnson had been living a double life, and that life had led to his death. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Rachel, I need you to think hard. Did Thomas ever mention anything about a man named Frank? Or someone named Gary? Any names that stood out? Anyone from his past who might have known about the gun? About the silencer?" Rachel paused, her mind clearly racing, but nothing came to her. "No, nothing like that." Marcus let out a low whistle. "This just got more complicated." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed, interrupting the tension in the room. She glanced at the screen, an email from her team. It was a confirmation from the forensics lab. They had finally analyzed the bullet that killed Thomas. The findings were chilling. The bullet that killed Thomas was not from the gun registered to him, Sarah murmured aloud. It came from a different weapon, one that had been modified. Rachel's face went pale. "What does that mean?" Sarah stood up, her mind racing. "It means your husband wasn't just a victim. He was part of something bigger. Someone wanted him dead, Rachel, and I think you've been caught in the middle." The investigation had just taken another dark turn. The case was no longer just about Rachel's self-defense. Someone else was involved, a shadowy figure pulling the strings behind Thomas's death. Sarah was now sure of one thing. This wasn't an open and shut case. It was only the beginning. The investigation had taken a terrifying turn, and Sarah knew they were now in deep. The discovery of the modified weapon, along with the mysterious man in the gun store footage, was a clear signal that Thomas Johnson's death was part of something far more dangerous than a simple domestic dispute. Sarah could feel the walls closing in as she tried to piece together the puzzle of Thomas's life, his connections, and the forces that led to his untimely demise. Rachel was still sitting in the chair, her face drained of all color. She had not said a word since the bombshell about the modified weapon had dropped. It was as if she had already started to grasp the full extent of the mess she was in, but still couldn't quite accept it. Sarah knew she had to keep pushing, had to keep digging, because every new layer of the case seemed to add to the complexity. "Marcus," Sarah said as she turned toward her colleague, who had been quietly standing by, his arms crossed and eyes scanning the latest evidence. "We need to know who's behind this. We need to trace this modified weapon and find out who's been pulling the strings." Marcus nodded and looked at his phone. "I'm on it, Sarah. I've already contacted the firearms expert at the lab. We'll have an answer soon." Just as Sarah was about to speak, her phone buzzed. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but she answered anyway. It was the last thing she had expected. "Detective Miller?" a voice on the other end asked. It was a low, gravelly voice, calm but carrying an unsettling weight. "I've got something you need to hear." Sarah sat up straighter, her instincts kicking in. "Who is this?" "You don't need to know my name," the voice replied cryptically. "But I know what you're digging into, and I know you're looking for answers. I've got the key, and if you want it, you'll have to listen carefully." Sarah's heartbeat quickened. This was the break she had been waiting for, or it was a trap, but she had no choice but to listen. "What do you know?" she asked, her voice low and controlled. The man on the other end chuckled darkly. "I know who Thomas was. I know what he was involved in, and I know who he was running from." Sarah's mind raced as she absorbed his words. "You're saying Thomas was in danger? He wasn't just abusive? He was being hunted." "Not hunted," the voice corrected, "but he got involved with the wrong people. Big mistake. Those people, they don't forget." A chill ran down Sarah's spine as she leaned forward, listening intently. "Who are these people? And what does this have to do with the silencer?" The voice was silent for a moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. Finally he spoke. "It's all about power, control. Thomas got in deep with a group that deals in more than just guns and money. They're into influence, political, financial. They work in the shadows, controlling things behind the scenes." A cold shiver ran through Sarah's body. This was no ordinary case. Thomas wasn't just a violent husband. He had become entangled in a criminal web far beyond what she had imagined. The voice continued. Thomas had something they wanted, something powerful. And when he started getting cold feet, they decided to make an example of him. He wasn't supposed to survive. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "You're saying Thomas wasn't just a victim of his own demons? He was targeted by a criminal organization?" "Exactly," the man said, his tone now a bit more urgent. "And that gun with the silencer? It wasn't just for protection. It was a way for them to keep their dirty work quiet. The silencer was used to make sure that no one could trace the shot, just like they've done with others before him." "Who's behind this?" Sarah pressed, her voice tight. "Who are these people?" The man on the other end hesitated, as if deciding whether to give her the name she was desperately searching for. "You're looking at a group known as the White Oak Syndicate. They've been operating in Ohio for years, and they've got their hands in everything. Guns, drugs, blackmail, and even high-level corruption. Thomas's biggest mistake was thinking he could walk away." A sinking feeling settled in Sarah's stomach. The White Oak Syndicate. She had heard rumors about them in the past, whispers of a shadowy organization with untouchable power and influence. But to hear it confirmed, to know that they were connected to Thomas's death, it made everything even more dangerous. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Sarah asked, struggling to keep her composure. "You've got to give me something more concrete." The voice chuckled again. "You're already in deep. The moment you started digging into Thomas's past, you walked into a trap of your own. If you want to make it out alive and get the full story, you'll have to play the game. Find out who's pulling the strings in Thomas's life. Follow the money, follow the people. But be careful. The White Oak Syndicate doesn't forgive. They don't forget." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. Her mind was reeling. The White Oak Syndicate was real, and it was behind Thomas's death. But now Sarah was caught between her duty as a detective and the very real threat that someone, somewhere, was watching her every move. Whoever this anonymous caller was, they had just set Sarah on a path she couldn't turn back from. Rachel, who had been silent throughout the phone call, looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. "Who was that? What did they say?" Sarah took a deep breath, trying to process the magnitude of the situation. "That was someone who knows more than we do. They claim that Thomas wasn't just a victim of domestic violence. He got involved with a dangerous group, a criminal syndicate, the White Oak Syndicate." Rachel's face went ashen. "Oh God, I didn't know. I didn't know he was mixed up with people like that." Sarah nodded grimly. "None of us did. But now everything we thought we knew about this case has changed." Marcus, who had been listening intently, crossed his arms and frowned. "The White Oak Syndicate. I've heard of them. They're into everything. Drugs, weapons, even rigging elections. This just got a whole lot bigger." Rachel stared at the floor, her hands trembling. I never thought, I thought I was just trying to protect my family. I didn't know what I was up against. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder, her voice soft but determined. You've been caught in the crossfire, Rachel, but we're going to get to the bottom of this. We'll find the truth, but you need to stay calm. There are dangerous people out there. If they know about you, they'll do whatever it takes to silence anyone who's in their way. Rachel nodded, her face pale but resolute. I don't care what it takes. I want to know what happened to my husband. I want to know why he died. Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. She had to move fast before the syndicate realized they were being pursued. This case had gone from a domestic tragedy to a full-blown criminal investigation. And if Sarah wasn't careful, she could be the next target. The truth was out there, buried under layers of lies, corruption, and criminal conspiracy. Sarah was no longer just investigating a murder. She was about to uncover a criminal empire, one that had been hiding in plain sight, and she was determined to expose it, no matter the cost.